Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Dan, for inviting me to speak and do the Kearney lecture this year. As you know, I went to Portsmouth and I went to Cornell. I grew up in New York City. I went to St. David's School, and after St. David's, we had to make a choice of where we were going to go on to school after that. I came for my tour to Portsmouth, and after the tour, we were escorted to the headmaster's office, Father Leo at the time. And during the interview, the post-tour interview, where we were discussing the school, Father Leo turns to my father and asks him, my father's a very quiet, sort of unassuming guy. He was Danish, didn't speak English very well. Father Leo turns to him and says, "What about you, Mr. Dietrich?" My father says, "I'm a hedonist." At that point, my mom falls out of the chair, Father Leo's mouth drops open, and I go, "What?" Needless to say, that was a long car ride home from Portsmouth, and with very little chance of my getting into the school. I think at the end of it, Father Leo probably felt sorry for me and took me anyway. While I was here, I was in the Red, which is now known as St. Leonard's. I was a varsity captain in the sailing team, and I was a prefect. And I had a great time when I was at Portsmouth. I really enjoyed going to school here, and I learned quite a bit of different things. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of a caveat emptor on this lecture today. It's already jumped over to the first slide, but this is a new lecture for me. I do a lot of lecturing. I talk about art collecting. I talk about looking at art, and but today I decided to do something a little different for Portsmouth and for the Kearney lecture, trying to focus in on Newport. The topic is the Gilded Age, or highlights of the Gilded Age in Newport, specifically in Newport. Mark Twain coined the term the Gilded Age in 1873 with his book, Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. To be honest with you, I have not read the book. It was published fairly early in his career, and as I understand it, he co-authored it with Charles Dudley Warner, and they each wrote 10 or 11 chapters. And basically, it was a profile of greed and political corruption in the United States, which, for being 1873 and in post-Civil War, was very early on for him to be able to, or for him to talk and write about that specific topic. To put it in perspective, Tom Sawyer was published in 1876. 3 years later, and Huckleberry Finn in 1884. So what was the Gilded Age? The Gilded Age was a period in post-Civil War America that encompassed the Reconstruction period and the Progressive period. The Reconstruction period, again, ended around 1877, and the Progressive period started immediately after that. The Progressive period was a period of economic and social reform and included higher wages for Americans. At that point, Americans were making 60% more than their counterparts in Europe. It limited the work week, the work day, to 8 hours a day. It abolished child labor, and it was also part of the reform, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, is the women's suffragette and the women's right to vote. The primary sources for wealth were transportation, which included shipping and trains, railroads, real estate, mining, raw materials, oil, factories, production, and of course, finance. These businesses were essentially controlled by the robber barons. And here's a short list of the robber barons, some of the robber barons who were known to Newport. William Astor was the patriarch of the Astor family. He wasn't really he was more old New York, old money New York, but their family did eventually come to Newport. Actually, they were one of the first ones to come to Newport. Ogden Astor, who also managed real estate investments from his family. We had the Vanderbilts, which are probably the best known of the robber barons and are really controlled that era. The Vanderbilts' wealth, one of the sons, Cornelius, the older son, at one time had more money than the U.S. Treasury and was able, actually ended up bailing out the U.S. Treasury at one point during his life. So we had the two Vanderbilts, and then sandwiched between them I have Oliver Hazard Perry, who is sort of a character in all of this. Not all of the robber barons had mansions in Newport. J.P. Morgan, for example, preferred to be on his yacht and traveled to Europe quite a bit. When he came to Newport, he was on board his yacht. Andrew Carnegie, Thomas Mellon, Frick, they did not come to Newport, except maybe as visitors from time to time. So why Newport? Well, the social structure of New York was based on what is known as the Astor 400. The Astor 400 was the number of people that Mrs. Astor could accommodate in her ballroom. She didn't really formulate or form the Astor 400. This gentleman, Ward McAllister, it was his concept, and he felt that there were only 400 families who were worthy of being included in New York society. He established and maintained the list, and it was always based on Mrs. Astor's ability to host 400 people. It varied in size from anywhere from 300 to 400, depending on any given year. But he was one of the first residents of Newport, of New York society to come to Newport rather. And he was really the one who was responsible for turning Newport into this mecca for the status conscious of the Gilded Age. And primarily that was, to start off with, Mrs. Astor. She bought a house called Beechwood, and if you drive around, if you go around Newport today, it's still here. A lot of these mansions are still here and are being used either by the Newport Preservation Society or still run privately. She bought Beechwood from Daniel Parrish, who had it built in 1851 and was designed by Andrew Jackson Downing. The key thing with Beechwood was when she bought that house, the ballroom would not accommodate her 400. So she retained the architect, Richard Morris Hunt, to renovate Beechwood and build out the ballroom so that it could accommodate her 400 guests. This painting of Mrs. Astor that I have here is by Carlos Duran. He was a well-known portrait painter of the period. He was European, French. And this portrait actually hung in her entryway in New York, in her townhouse in New York. It was said to overlook and pass judgment on people who were passing through and coming into her home. So this is Beechwood, as she pretty much looks today. The ballroom was on the second floor, and you can almost see in this photograph, when you look at the middle window, you can see the sky and the window further down at the end. The house is under construction right now. It was bought by Larry Ellison of Oracle, and he's turning it into a museum for his 18th and 19th century paintings. He has some spectacular stuff, so when that opens, it'll be very interesting to see his collection all put together. But Richard Morris Hunt redid the ballroom. This is the way it pretty much looked. I love this room because it's fairly simple as far as Newport mansion rooms go, especially for the large size. This is looking out the back. It has a simple white ceiling with a very delicate and detailed molding and architectural accents along the corners with inset painted decoration to give it some color, the chandelier, of course, and the polished wood floors. So that's what it looked like, pretty much looked like. A lot of these rooms are unchanged from the way they were originally built. Next person to follow Mrs. Astor were the Gillette brothers, Peter and Ogden Gillette. Peter Gillette they also managed property and did banking in New York. Peter Gillette, this is Ogden, but Peter, the older brother, was a simple man, came to Newport early on, followed the Astors, and bought a house called Southside over on the northeast side of Aquidneck Island, actually on the property where Salve, Regina, is over there. His brother then visited him, decided he wanted to come to Newport and stay, and he was a big yachtsman. These are his yachts: Norseman, a racing schooner, and Mayflower, his steam yacht. Mayflower actually became the presidential yacht in 1899 for Teddy Roosevelt. But Ogden then decided to come to Newport, and he bought the property next to Southside, his brother's property, called Ochre Court, and built a fabulous, fabulous house, a little house, Ochre Court. It's a French revival, Louis XIII style. It is huge. It's the second largest mansion in Newport, and the largest at the time. The Louis XIII style, this is again looking at the back, so our backs would be to the ocean. And this is the wonderful gardens and outdoor courtyard they had. The Louis XIII style is identified by the peaked roofs, the turrets, and a lot of exterior detail around the windows. The great room, the great hall in Ochre Court, which is now, by the way, the administration building for Salve Regina College, or university, this is how it looks today. Again, original. And I love the way Richard Morris Hunt, who was the designer of this building, he made this into almost like a cake. It's a wonderful thing. This is all white marble, and notice the symmetry and the balance. I mean, that was one of the things that Richard Morris Hunt was known for, and the influence of his going to l'École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and studying architecture there. Then on top of the white marble, he has this mahogany wood second floor gallery, which is detailed. You can't see it so well in this photograph, but with pieces of Numidian marble and gold leaf wood carvings. And surmounting that was the support for this wonderful arch ceiling, which encompasses a mural that, unfortunately, I can't get a very good photograph of these things, but it has a wonderful mural. And as an architect and as a viewer of this, maybe you don't see it, but one of the things are the repetitive motifs. You're going to see the arches, the secondary arches above the doors, the arches in the mahogany going all the way around, and then the little eyelet arches along the top for the supports of the ceiling. So now we're going to come to the first of the Vanderbilts. This is William K. Vanderbilt. He had numerous homes in the U.S. and France. He loved horse racing. He was an important art collector, and he was the builder of Marble House, one of the first another one of the great houses built in Newport for the Gilded Era. I said he was a great art collector. His father, William H. Vanderbilt, was also an aggressive collector, buying 6 or 8 paintings at a clip, what I call shotgun-style collecting. But William K. was a little different. He really bought very, very special things, including the wonderful Rembrandt of the Man in the Oriental Costume, and the Boucher, the Toilette de Venus. Now, he also bought a lot of paintings, and he ended up leaving them all when he died in 1920. He left them all to the Metropolitan Museum, so they're available for all of you to go see if you're interested in looking at some of his collection. it's funny because in the houses in Newport, there was almost no art. Regardless of which house you go into, you're not going to see a lot of art. These paintings would have hung in his townhouse in New York. But as I said, he agreed to build with his wife Alva Marble House. Now, Marble House was a great undertaking. Alva, his wife, studied art and architecture in France. She felt she was fairly well versed in it. Here we see Richard Morris Hunt, who had helped with the renovation of Beechwood, had designed Ochre Court, and now we find him taking over the design work for Marble House. They had a very good working relationship, though Mrs. Vanderbilt always had to remind him that she was the one who was going to be living in the house. What she wanted to do was to build a temple to the arts. Richard Morris Hunt was a graduate of l'École des Beaux-Arts. He's the first American to ever graduate from l'École des Beaux-Arts. And really had a lot of influence in American architecture. He designed all these mansions, but to really put it in perspective, he also designed the base for the Statue of Liberty. He designed the facade for the Metropolitan Museum, and he also designed the Grand Hall for the Metropolitan Museum, which he never saw the completion of that, but his sons did finish that, and that's who did the actual design for that. So, we have the Petit Trianon. This was the basis for the inspiration for Marble House. It's just natural for Richard Morris Hunt to choose this. It was a very traditional French design. It's very boxy, but it has some key elements that were inspired by classic Greek architecture. In other words, the columns, those railings, and built up on a pediment or pedestal. Let's see. So let's take a look at, and this is Marble House. You can see that he actually, I think he improved somewhat on the design of Le Petit Trianon and added some interesting details to it. One, he built out the front of the house to create a porte cochere so the carriages could pull up. He also raised the entrance up so that the carriages would have to come up the driveway and come up, approaching the house from a lower level and coming up to this grand entryway. Again, you can see the symmetry and the balance and the beautiful landscaping that he did. And I don't know if you can see these two guys here taking some glam shots. They are not in the right place. I think they should have had the house in. So, from the interior, this is the entry, and as I said, there wasn't a lot of art here. You can see in the dining room there was a little bit of art. There's a sculpture of Louis XIV up at the top. He was a lot of the inspiration for the interior. This is yellow sienna marble from Italy. The Vanderbilts actually had to build their own dock for the marble deliveries that came in for this house. While the house was being built, Mrs. Vanderbilt had an 8-foot fence constructed around the property, one, so that the general public couldn't see the house being built, but two, her next-door neighbor, Mrs. Astor, could not see what was being built. There was a lot of rivalry and with the size of the houses and other things. So what I love about this is that with the absence of art, the marble takes over as the decorative motif and is highlighted and shows off the gilt bronze work for the balusters and stair railings, and also the gilt, you can barely see it, but at the very top, these gilt pennants, wood-carved pennants that hung over the windows. Okay, and this is the dining room. It's done in red Numidian marble. This is one of those murals that I was talking about, a neoclassical or mythological mural. At the end of the room is a copy of a painting of Louis XIV. There were 3 paintings in this room, and that was about it for the house. Other than the family rooms, the bedrooms, there were paintings of the family members. Each of those chairs, the side chairs are bronze. They weigh 75 pounds each, and the end chairs are 100 pounds each. And you needed to have a footman come and help you get in and out of your seating at the table. So this is the gilt room, or the gold room, and this is the only room that deviates from the marble motif in Marble House. Carved wood, all gilt, with the exception of the fireplace, heavy bronze sculptures holding the lighting fixtures. Most of the lighting fixtures were rigged both for electricity and gas. And a very different room. When the sun comes in this room, it actually sparkles. You almost need to wear sunglasses when you go in that room. So I'm going to deviate just for a second here. The Vanderbilts had 3 kids. Consuelo, William Jr., and Harold. And this painting by John Singer Sargent is famous. It's at Blenheim Palace. Alva was obsessed with, 1, her house looking like a palace, and 2, marrying her daughter off to royalty. So in an arranged marriage to the 9th Duke of Marlborough, plus $2.5 million in 1895 money, she married her daughter Consuelo off to the Duke of Marlborough. Consuela was not happy about that. She actually tried to fight it. At this point, her parents were divorced and tried to get her father to intervene. He would not. And when John Singer Sargent painted this painting, he said that she was desolate. And she looks désolée in this, okay? And I very much feel for her. But this is one of the classic John Singer Sargent paintings, and we'll see a couple more as we go. Here are a few more images of Consuelo. I don't want to dwell on it. She had this wonderful long neck, and this is her wedding card on the left, a painting by Paul César Helou that was sold at Christie's. It's actually a pastel on canvas, and I believe it sold for almost $500,000, which is very unusual for a pastel. But again, the emphasis on her long neck. And then I love this photograph on the right. It's Madame Jacques Balsan, that's Mrs. Vanderbilt, Consuelo on the right, and C.C. Guest. This is the sort of old money, new money confrontation. It's, Mrs. Vanderbilt with the finger out saying, I know better than you, I've been through this. And C.C. Guest was a socialite, so she was a feather in the wind as far as Mrs. Vanderbilt was concerned, or Mrs. Balsan. One last thing, just in the photograph on the right and the wedding card, you notice the pearls around her neck. Those are the famous Vanderbilt pearls. And when I went to Marble House to do research for this, the woman didn't know about the Vanderbilt pearls. And then when I pointed it out to her, she said, "Oh yeah, they're in this photo. They're in this photo. Those are the Vanderbilt pearls." So now we're going to talk a little bit about Opie Belmont. And after Alva divorced Mr. Vanderbilt, a year later she married Mr. Belmont. He was from a banking family. His father worked for the Rothschilds. He was trained as a banker in Germany. His grandfather was Commodore Matthew Perry, who opened up Japan for trade. His uncle was Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry, who won the Battle of Lake Erie. He was a one-time congressman. When his house, Belmont, which was also designed by Richard Morris Hunt, was completed, he was just 33 years old. And he married Alva Vanderbilt in 1896, and they moved into Belcourt. Now, Mr. Belmont was not a nice guy. I think he got married. He'd been married to Sarah Swan Whiting. On their honeymoon, he abandoned her. and went off with a dancer to the south of France in the middle of their honeymoon. So he had a reputation as a playboy and a troublemaker. But this is Belcourt. Richard Morris Hunt really struggled with this. It has no comprehensive design plan. Belmont wanted, German this, French that, Italian that. And then on top of it all, he wanted his stables below the ballroom. Well, just imagine going to a ball at Belmont and having 20 horses below you. The stink, the noise, all the problems that go along with owning horses. When he died, the house was then passed on to one of his relatives. And Alva went back and reopened. She had closed Marble House, except for the laundry and her bedroom, which she kept as a closet, because she didn't want her clothes in the house or the laundry in the house because of the horses. So after Belmont died, she reopened Marble House, which had been closed for, I think, 5 years, and built the famous Chinese tea house. The Chinese tea house was designed by Richard Morris Hunt's sons. He had now passed away. They went to China. They researched the tea houses, all on Mrs. Vanderbilt's, or Mrs. Belmont's now, tab. The picture up on the upper right are the Vanderbilt girls, including Alva in the middle, Alva Belmont in the middle, and Consuela all the way to the left, and some of the other Vanderbilt girls. And this is where she would host both family events and her suffragette events, and host parties for both of those. And I just threw that suffragette poster in there so you can get an idea. Right after Belmont died, she did make amends with her daughter, and that's why they're there. So this is actually William Kay's older brother, Cornelius II. They inherited the same amount of money, and the interesting thing about both of these Vanderbilts was that neither of them increased their fortune, nor did they lose their fortune. So they increased their assets, property, art holdings, and whatever, and gave a lot of money away, but they died with the same amount of money that they inherited. I think it was $55 million each that they inherited, and they died with the same. So Cornelius bought a house called the Breakers. It was a wooden structure. It had been owned by the Lorillard family, tobacco magnates. When they bought the house, they were very happy with it. They did some renovations, and then eventually the house burned down. They had extended the season to November, which is unusual. The house wasn't really equipped for winter weather, so there were fires going in a lot of rooms, and luckily nobody was hurt. So after the house burned down, he commissioned Richard Morris Hunt, who is still alive at this point, to build the New Breakers, which became the largest house mansion in Newport, surpassing Ogden Goulet's Ochre Court. And I think this is really a triumph of Richard Morris Hunt's design and abilities as an architect, as far as mansions go, certainly. It is in an Italian villa style, though it's far grander than any villa I've ever been to. It's a wonderful place to go. It's got the tile roof. Again, you see the symmetry and the balance, which is part of Richard Morris Hunt's trademark. And then you have these double porches here, which the family used to have breakfast on the upper porch. The Vanderbilts, Cornelius and his wife Alice, maintained a relatively low social profile in New York, meaning they only had parties once a week or twice a week. And this is the Grand Hall and the Breakers. Interesting design principle. It's 50 by 50 by 50 square feet, so it's a perfect box. If you enter, you would enter, the main entrance would be to the left. You would walk in through the vestibule and come into the grand hall, looking straight out onto the ocean. So as you walked into the house, you see the ocean. When you go there today, it's on a beautiful day. It's a wonderful sight. Again, because it was an Italian villa style, it had this, what was supposed to be a skylight in a real Italian villa, but they had painted it as a sky. You just barely see the strip there. So this house really, Richard Morris Hunt died while this house was being constructed, but it was actually turned out to be his masterpiece, and I believe his sons helped finish it. So the interior design on Marble House was overseen and done by a guy named Ogden Codman. Ogden Codman had studied in France, again, and worked very hard with a friend to help come up with the right feel for such a grand and large house. That person, this is Richard Morris Hunt, again by John Singer Sargent. I'm going to deviate a little bit here. This portrait was commissioned by George Vanderbilt, who owned the house Biltmore down in North Carolina. Not really pertinent to Newport, but this is a painting of him and what he looked like just before he died. And then I have another John Singer Sargent. This is the artist Anton Carolus, who painted the wonderful portrait of Mrs. Vanderbilt. And then we have John Singer Sargent himself. And he was really the preeminent portrait painter of the time. He was requested. He was born in Florence, studied at L'École des Beaux-Arts, studied with Carolus, did that wonderful family portrait of the 9th Duke of Marlborough, painted many of the Vanderbilt family members, as well as presidents and other distinguished personages. So he studied at L'École des Beaux-Arts. He got into a little bit of trouble afterwards when he painted the famous portrait of Madame X. And if you don't know that story, it's sort of an interesting story. He originally did the painting for the salon with the strap off of her shoulder, which was a no-no, and was sort of excised from French society for a while and ended up moving to England. But he was really the acclaimed portrait painter. This portrait in the Uffizi was requested by the Uffizi to hang in their portrait gallery. So that's the status, sort of status that John Singer Sargent had. So this is where I had deviated because Ogden Codman, the designer, was actually friends with Edith Wharton. And of course, Edith Wharton wrote a couple of books on the Gilded Age and the Society of the Gilded Age and the issues, House of Mirth and Age of Innocence. But what you probably don't know is that she wrote a book on decorating houses with this interior designer, Ogden Codman. She was also friends with Alice Vanderbilt. So she really cut some bones as far as being a decorator on the breakers. She really disdained the Gilded Age and the affluent people who were part of the Gilded Age. She felt she was an old-style New Yorker, a Knickerbocker, so pre-Gilded Age and pre-Revolutionary Civil War. She did interior study design in Europe when she was there, when she traveled there. She purchased a house. This is our last house we're going to look at, Land's End in Newport, and completely redid it. And so with all of her social commentary on the Gilded Age, her criticism of the Gilded Age, she actually lived in, a modest house, but a very nice house. Let me see if I've forgotten anything here. I think that's it. And that's my presentation for today. I didn't know how long my talk was going to take, And I had incorporated a whole nother section, which I'm just going to run through quickly, and then I'll take some questions. One of the questions that I had when I was researching and preparing this talk was, here are these guys buying these houses, decorating, obviously collecting European art. And some of it was very good European art, some of it was crappy European art, but it was almost exclusively European art. So what was going on in American art during this period? So I'm going to show you a couple of paintings by American artists that were going on during this period. And this first one by William Bradford is, and this is really sort of my specialty, I actually sold this painting to the current owner, depicts the sloop Gracie in the lead for the 1883 Gillette Cup. Now we know Ogden Gillette, he was a great yachtsman. He sponsored a number of trophies for New York Yacht Club, both for schooners and for sloops. And this is a painting of Gracie. And Bradford was a luminous painter, though this is earlier on in his career. Interesting, he used tar mixed in with his paint. So a lot of his paintings have this very dark overcast. Okay. This is an Ogden Gillette trophy for the Gillette Cup, won by Titania for 1889. Tiffany Trophy, wonderful. Tiffany at the time were the premier silver makers and decorative arts creators during the Gilded Age. You go into any of the houses, the flatware is all Tiffany. Any of the silver is Tiffany. I mean, there's some Ballroom, there's some Whiting, there's some Black Star and Frost, but most of it's Tiffany. Tiffany was the name, and sort of like Richard Morris Hunt was, part of this social circle. This trophy is absolutely wonderful. It has the tumultuous sea for the base, with the sea nymphs rising up, supporting the cup or the chalice, the great engraving and chasing, which makes up the name, won by Titania from Bedouin and Gracie, one yacht pictured in the previous slide. I don't know if you can see it, but the molding under the text, under the engraving for the text, is all little sea berries. And you have the undulating edge. The two handles are the heads of Poseidon, and the interior is gilt. And we have a couple of other paintings that I'll just go through. This one by James Edward Buttersworth. Again, I sold this painting to the current owner. Shows the yacht Psyche and I think Rambler coming into Newport after a day of racing. And that would be the point just outside of Fort Adams there. Again, a luminous painter, British influence. He was born in England, came to the United States, and found his niche doing yacht and ship portraits. He has a wonderful eye for detail. He is terrible at drawing and painting buildings and architecture, but great at painting yachts. And unfortunately, this was before the painting was clean, but you can see the bright spots in the sky, but also look at the reflection of the yacht in the water here. Wonderful, wonderful rendering of these racing yachts. And here's a John Frederick Tennyson. We actually sold this when I was at Christie's. Very subtle painting, but of Second Beach. If you go to Second Beach, I don't know if you guys ever get a chance to go out to Second Beach, but Second Beach arches around, and this is obviously a very quiet pastoral shot. Again, it's about the light, the water, the rendering of the water, the motion of the water, and the stillness of the beach and the sand. I got a couple more. This is also Second Beach. That rock formation is still there. Again, very calm. Look at the reflection both of the sky, the mirroring of the landscape here, the way it builds out, the mirroring of the yacht, the water. This trail here, I believe is now Purgatory Road, and St. George's, boo, is down on that side. Okay, and this is the last of these luminous paintings I'm going to show you, and then I'll really be done. This is by William Charles Richards. He actually lived over in Jamestown, Connecticut Island. very different from the other paintings I've shown you where it's relatively still, quiet, placid, early morning scenes. This is a dawn scene with the surf crashing up against the rocks. What I love about this is the way the sun, and here we talk about luminous painters, it's about the light, the way the sun is breaking through, and how it highlights different parts of the clouds, the way it highlights the back of the sea, but then shows the translucency of the water and the waves. And he creates the foam that gives the waves the shape in a very, very realistic manner, and uses the light and dark to accentuate that. And that's it. The question is, why were they building in European style rather than developing a new style for American type of architecture? And the answer to that is that almost all of the people who were involved in the design and the decoration of the mansions were trained in Europe. And so those were the influences. And a lot of that harkens back to ancient Greece and Greek architecture and then Roman architecture, the classical styles, which are the principles that if you were, even today, to go to l'École des Beaux-Arts, they are going to teach you those very, very structured, strict, formulaic designs from the classic period. Or, yeah. Well, okay, so I mean, if you look at Larry Ellison, who's one of the richest men in the world, and he's just bought Astor Court, okay? And I think he's doing what I would say is a very kind restoration, but he's turning that into a museum, and it'll be open to the public. A lot of the mansions are still owned privately. And if you drive around, if you go walk down the Cliff Walk or you go around Ocean Drive, most of those houses are still privately owned and are owned by very wealthy people, obviously. They don't have the staffing that the Vanderbilts would have. I believe Marble House had 30 staff that resided there. So it's all about staffing and also how much they're used. The Vanderbilts and the Gillettes only use these houses for, at most, 4 weeks. Most of them only for 4 weeks, or 8 weeks rather, a year, for 2 months. But otherwise, they didn't use them. That's why there's not a lot of art in those houses, because they didn't want to leave the art. These houses were unheated and exposed to the elements, and so they didn't want to put a lot of art in there as well. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's a question of staffing. It's a question of use. There's certainly a lot of. I mean, if you look at Bill Gates' house, for example, in Seattle, it's a magnificent house. Would that be considered a Gilded Age mansion? Yes, absolutely. The way it's built and the amount of. I don't know whether I really want to go there, but I can. A William Chaucer Richards like this is probably north of 100,000, between 150 and 250,000. I can tell you because it's a matter of public record. Let's see if we can go back. Not that one. Sorry. Let's see if I can do this. Gotta go. Okay. So this painting sold at Christie's for about $500,000. And you can look that up. If you go to the Christie's website, type in Kensett, it'll come up. That's public record. So the American art is, in the up to $1 million, more than $1 million, depending on the artist. It all depends on the artist. If you're looking at the Rembrandt, go figure. That's a whole different level of value. Working at some place like Christie's or Sotheby's is not too different from working at Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs. You're just trading art instead of trading money. When you start out at a place like Christie's, you're the low dog on that totem pole. You're in a bullpen with probably 30 or 40 other people, and all you're doing is pushing paper. You're answering inquiries, you're pushing paper. Once you learn, you work your way up the food chain a little bit and gain some expertise, then you start having a little bit more say in evaluating the art. You've learned to evaluate the art, the condition of the art, whether, where it fits in the marketplace. So it's about evaluating the art. And then once you get to the highest rungs, it's all about working with the clients and filling voids in their collection, helping them manage their collections, and also sourcing material. There's a lot of competition between Sotheby's, especially between Sotheby's and Christie's, for the big estates. Christie's has coming up the Rockefeller estate. That was a major coup from them. I know that I know the chairman of Christie's very well, and I know that he worked very, very hard for 15 or 20 years to get that estate. So there's a long game in that. But on a day-to-day thing, it can be fun. Most of the people are very nice. Some of the people are a little stuck up. But it's a very interesting thing. But it is work. It is work. There's no, sitting around just looking at pretty pictures all the time. I'm going to tell one last story, Portsmouth Story. When I was here in I think it was my fifth form year, it was the winter of my fifth form, and I was at Sunday dinner. Father Damien was the table master that night at the table I was sitting at. And Mr. Marcoux, who I think he was the head of the math department at the time, used to come on Sunday dinner and would bring his two high school age daughters to dinner on Sunday nights. And they were sitting next to me, and I was with Father Damien, and I kept looking over at Mr. Marcoux's table and at his daughters. Father Damien, as only Father Damien could do, said, "Mr. Dietrich, I suggest you keep your eyes to this table and not wander over to that table unless you'd really like to go sit over there." I said, "No, Father, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be staring." So a few days later, I'm walking across campus, I'm hustling across campus, and here comes Father Damien. "Mr. Dietrich." "Yes, Father." "I thought you might have interest in the mansions in Newport." I said, "Father, that sounds very interesting." I was like, "Really?" I'm like, "Why is he telling me this?" "Yeah, I think you should see about going into Newport one Sunday and visiting one of the mansions. Maybe the Marble House." "Yes, Father." So a couple of Sundays later, I go to my housemaster, Mr. Lawson, and I said, "Mr. Lawson, I'd like to get a pass to go into Newport to visit Marble House." "Oh, really? That sounds like a wonderful idea. Did you know that Betty Marcoux was a tour guide at the Marble House?" No, I didn't know that, but that's good news. So off I went to the Marble House the first time. No Betty Marcoux. The second time, no Betty Marcoux. Third time, no Betty Marcoux. Boy, by that time, I was giving the tours of the Marble House. Well, I later found out that Betty had been transferred over to the Breakers. It was just my luck, okay? So eventually, Betty and I did meet, and we actually went to junior prom together and senior prom together, and she's still my friend today. That's all I got. That's my how I got interested in the Gilded Age and how Father Damien influenced me on several different fronts.